The Gospel of Luke tells us that on the day of Jesus' death, about noon, I quote, "About noon, darkness came over the whole land, and while the sun's light failed, Jesus breathed his last. When the centurion saw this, he praised God and said, 'Certainly, this was an innocent man.'" If the Roman soldier who carried out Jesus' execution recognizes his innocence, why didn't he cry out for justice? Why didn't he or any of Jesus' loyalists muster the crowd of Gentiles, Jews, Romans, people of all ethnic and economic backgrounds whom Jesus had touched? Why didn't he get them to rally together? Why didn't Jesus' followers retaliate? It's Jesus' ministry itself that tells us why. His life, death, and resurrection presents the clearest lens to see the world with God's eyes of unfathomable grace. Today's lectionary reading returns us to Jesus' Sermon on the Plain as contained in the Gospel of Luke. And before continuing on with this seminal sermon, let's consider the overall context in which it's preached. Theophilus is a man whose name literally means lover of God. He'd commissioned a writer to compose Luke's gospel sometime about 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. The intended audience for this gospel includes all of those whose lives were upended by a peasant girl's illegitimate son, whose only crime was to heal people and preach love. Anyone who encounters this gospel already knows that Jesus' supporters betray him and abandon him before he dies on the cross. And everyone who encounters this gospel does so because they have heard of the life-changing stories of those who witnessed the resurrected Christ, proving that God will not let violence have the final word. The readers of this gospel come with a curiosity, how and why? And those same readers are also then presented with a choice. After you've read the gospel, after you've heard of these stories, do you return to a tit-for-tat ethos of life that continues to rank people by what they possess and their capacity to dominate others? Do you do that and then continue in this spiral of violence and revenge? That would be the easy path, because that's what people have done. Or do those that now know the gospel delve into the heart of Jesus' ministry so that God's grace continues to change the lives of people yet today and tomorrow? It's the latter choice that holds irresistible allure, and it also comes with a warning. If you opt to follow in Jesus' path, that too will mark you as an enemy to those who seek to preserve the status quo and don't want love to prevail. That was the decision of those early readers of the gospel, and that's our decision yet today. So let's go back to this story that was recorded. Let's go stand side beside those disciples as Jesus speaks. He's already called those who endure poverty and hunger blessed. And then he warns the rich and the full. He tells them, woe. We can imagine this crowd who's gathered to listen to him are about to erupt into shouts of, yeah, let's go get him. But then it also starts to thin, because to those still listening, meaning the disciples at the time of the sermon and those of us who, like Theophilus, want to know how Jesus changes the world, we get a little intimidated by his radical, nonsensical teachings, even though we really do want his grace. So before I read Jesus' words, please pray with me. Dear God, we crave your Son's words of grace. So we ask you to silence the noise around and send your Spirit among us and startle us with his truth. Amen. So Jesus is speaking, and this is from the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. Listen for his living word. But I say to you that are listening, love your enemies, Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, also offer the other. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who asks of you, and if anyone takes away what is yours, do not ask for it back. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you love those who love you, what credit is it to you? For even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you can expect to receive payment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. Instead, I say to you, love your enemies, do good, lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he himself is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Friends, this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Jesus startles his listeners, first of all, with love your enemies. And that word enemy jars us. He knows that. That's why he chose that word. Whenever I hear the word enemy, I think of a member of a congregation that I once served. In Bob's house, when you entered it, he had a hallway that led to the office, and it was lined with photographs taken over decades of the various men who'd served as Secretary of Defense, U.S. presidents, and the heads of state from around the globe, along with Bob standing right next to them. It was a complete gallery. You see, Bob had built a sprawling multinational company to supply weaponry to our country's military and our allies. His success depended upon knowing the enemy, our enemies, and the allies of those other enemies. His company, I actually remember seeing this palette, they had a refined palette of all the nuanced hues of the color of sand that existed from one desert to another in all the various theaters of conflict around the globe. You needed to paint your fighting vehicles in the right color. His company understood the literacy and the vocational aptitude of members of the armed forces so that the weapons could maximize their strike effectiveness. Bob made it his business literally to know the enemy. And he took that same laser focus to know his competitors as he battled for contracts just as fiercely. When you look for enemies, you find them everywhere. And such a perspective also prods you to consider, who sees me as an enemy? Does my enemy know me as well? My friends, as I was thinking about him and my conversations with him, my heart continued to race. He was a formidable man. He towered he was good 6'3" tall. He was towering both in terms of stature, but also his keen intellect. But in our conversations, I learned all about his company, but then he drilled me on the tenets of faith just as rigorously as he would a divisional CFO forecasting profits. Bob would demand, how am I to love those, and fill in the blanks of all of the folks who threaten our national security? How am I supposed to love them? And then his fierce patriotism would absolutely shine. And then he'd ask, how am I supposed to love, and again, fill in the blank of all of those that you can imagine who threaten your personal safety? We'd have that conversation, and he actually would begin to soften a bit. Because faith is one of the few aspects of his life that prompted keen humility, because he wanted to understand, and it's hard. He craved this conversation of how do I love them as much as discerning how to profit from knowing an enemy, because Bob understood the incalculable human cost of war. He'd served in World War II. He knew the impact of killing, both at the present time and for future generations. He'd made a fortune for himself, and he also enhanced the stock portfolios of all those endowments and foundations that he supported. And he supported them with his contributions of money because he wanted to build a community. He wanted to find new ways. And that's when we talk about, what does love look like? What does it look like in human behavior? And what does forgiveness feel like? He'd been a lifelong Christian, and he knew all the stories of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, and God's plan to end the cycle of one enemy retaliating against another. Because, my friends, grace changed everything for that centurion, and grace changed everything for those who encountered the risen Christ. Grace tells us that God sees us as we are broken and loves us still. And grace invites us to see ourselves and to see one another with the eyes of God, because grace always changes everything. This leads us back to that conversation Jesus has with his disciples on that dusty road in Galilee. Thank God for the generosity of that man Theophilus who funded this gospel to be written, and for all of those other lovers of God who want to know the story of grace. When Jesus says, "Love your enemies and expect nothing in return," he asks us to deny the deeply rooted behaviors passed down from one generation to another. He knows that violence begets more violence, and that's how family feuds and clans continue to fight one another. And Jesus dismisses what is widely acceptable of, if you love those who love you, so what is what he says. Even sinners can love those who love them. Anyone who can love them. That's not hard. That's not love, in fact. And he also says anyone can lend to anyone from whom they expect a repayment. That kind of lending is merely a transaction. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. When you take a closer look at this transaction-based behavior, you see the real problem. In these scenarios, what you do then dictates how I respond. It all proceeds okay if we each do what the other person expects. But if the other party falls short, then I feel justified to even up the stakes. I might seek revenge, and that's when the spiral begins. But how I behave is not dependent upon how you behave. It's always dependent upon my willingness to try to please God first. You see, when we return hate with hate, hate spreads. And once hate inspires our actions, we see everyone as an enemy, and everyone loses. Jesus asks his disciples to follow along with him as he takes his roadside teaching into ordinary life. From this point forward in the Gospel of Luke, he moves through Galilee and the surrounding area to prove how grace, how forgiveness changes everything. He ignores the class hierarchies and ethnic divisions. He heals the leper, forgives the sinner, and includes the Gentiles. Those words roll off my tongue. We know those age-old stories, but we can never take for granted how incredibly hard it was then, and how incredibly hard it is for us today, and yet that's what we're expected to do. He taught us what to do, and we're to do likewise. His parables thrive even in secular settings. Everyone knows the story of the Good Samaritan, whether they're a Christian or not. That Good Samaritan's charity of tending a nearly dead man with his cold cash and no chance of repayment is something we all admire. And the prodigal son, again, we can say the word prodigal son and we all understand what that means. It's a wayward youth who is lured away for the good life, squanders everything, and is welcomed home even before he repents. In each of these encounters, Jesus breaks the cycle of tit for tat to maintain equilibrium or gain dominance. He refuses to retaliate, and he demonstrates God's generous grace. Loving one's enemy, though, does not mean that we acquiesce to the powers that be. It does not mean that we have inaction in the face of injustice or a lack of protest. We don't bury our head in the sand or look at our feet and think somebody else is going to fix this. We see this in the witness of Jesus himself. He doesn't shy away from calling out the hypocrisy of the authorities. He goes toe-to-toe with them. And he asks them to watch and listen, and then to repent and join him, because they're never his enemy. Jesus spends the bulk of his ministry giving tangible examples to that ethereal ideal to love all people. And then when he's finished, in the presence of Jesus' death, God does not inspire retaliation. God merely rolls back the stone and continues to startle us over and over again with grace. God invites us into a life to continue, even when God knows the worst that we can do. To love our enemies is not a call to grit our teeth and resolve to be nicer to those unkind to us. It doesn't mean we fabricate something. It doesn't mean we deny something. It means we get smarter about the tactics of love, smarter about the breadth of people who will collaborate with us in being a loving community. It's to follow the narrow and risky path, trusting that grace is the place that brings the church out of hiding back then. It's grace that brought the centurion and all of those followers to embolden a new way of life and to dissolve the hate that festers between us. That's the decision that centurion made centuries ago. He admires and receives God's grace, and he became an agent. And that's the decision before us as well. We have to admit that we don't have the power to follow this gospel or any other gospel ideas such as loving others, forgiving enemies, living simply, without union with God. And this, my friends, is what's offered to us and to everyone else, ally, foe, friend, and enemy. It's offered to everyone because grace changes everything. We can never love our enemies without accepting the amazing grace of his resurrection and the forgiveness that's offered to us all, because grace is what changes everything. May it be so, my friends.